Kind of moving on from that, when I first got on before I got on the department, I went to work for H. Edwards and Sons, and it was the mid-60s, and one of the neat things about H. Edwards and Sons was they did a lot of the service work on the hydrants, the water system, fixing water leaks, water mains, anything to do with the department. And so I went to work for them before I actually got on the fire department in 1968. And that was a big help. Then I became very good buddies with Henry Cutter once I was on the fire department. And that took on a whole new life of its own, because he was like, oh boy, I got a new kid that I'm going to take him and get him under my wing, and I'm going to just teach him what I want him to learn, you know. And there were a lot of good things. I spent many hours with Henry, and he talked a lot about the previous history about the fire department, how it got started, and he would always have my attention. I would always get very engrossed in his conversations. Kind of jumping back a little bit from that is one of the things when Marshall was talking before about the fire department starting in 1850, and some of the neat things that Henry would talk to me about was when the fire department started. One of the neat things was when they started appropriating some money. When the first hose that they bought was only six feet long, and the reason why it was only 6 feet long was it was made out of cowhide. And the cowhide, they had to go by the size of the cows. So that's the size of the actual.
Yeah, just send this around so people can actually see it when you're talking about it.
Oh, there you go.
It's just a section.
That's my assistant, Todd Breyer. Thank you, Todd.
Anna Breyer.
Yeah, yeah. So when I got into listening to that whole thing, the whole little rap about how the fire department got going, it really got engrossed in it and really got wrapped up in it. And for a long time, in the early 1870s, they started being able to buy more and better equipment. During the Civil War, they didn't have any money to do anything, so basically some of the equipment was getting pretty dilapidated. And by about 1880, in the 1880s, they had bought a hand pumper. And the neat thing about those hand pumpers was you could go down, you could suck water, but you had to have 4 to 5 guys on each side of the pumper. So it took like 8 to 10 guys to run that pump. They would have guys stand in the back of them to relieve them because they would get exhausted. You had to keep that rhythm when you were pumping that thing. And it all sounded like it was hoopla, you know, a big deal, but it was a big deal. And one of the tricks was that you wouldn't get your hand or your arm in the way, because it was an easy way to get your wrist broken when they were bringing the pump down. But at the same time, they would pump water out of the brook or the pond or whatever, and they would pump it into a holding tank. And there from the holding tank, it was back to the old bucket brigade. And that's what they would do. They would bail the water out of the holding tank to the fire. That went on for another number of years. Well, by 1890s, the population of the village really started to expand. They needed a better water source. And, you know, one of the things that basically happened a lot was anything outside a half or 3/4 of a mile outside of town, the old saying was, yeah, you know, you saved another cellar hole, because there was no way in hell that you could save buildings. You know, you would hook onto stuff with horse, you know, to pull them out to wherever the fire was. That kind of started to change a little bit, and they had to come up with a better way to supply water to the town and to the fire department. A lot of this was kind of an ongoing thing. The selectmen were arguing with the managers of the precinct. The precinct didn't really have, at that time, for a long time, they weren't fire chiefs, they were fire wards. And each section of town was broke into a certain section where the firewoods were in charge of. As far as like to the the Kentucky River boundary, up, towards Butterfield Farm and so forth. So this part of town started having fire protection. But outside of that half a mile, 3/4 of a mile radius, places were still burning flat because it was, almost impossible to get to them. And you have to remember that some of the ways that they actually connected to try and make things work was, for the longest time, even when they were still operating stuff in town, there wasn't the whistle that was on the tower at the time. Or was. They had to go, beside the Baptist church, they had a box. And on the box, or inside the box, was a key. You would go, if the fire broke out during the night, someone would go down to the church, take the key, open the door, take the key out, unlock the door of the church, and go in and ring the church bell. That was the warning signal. And so then it went from that method to, they moved it over to the town hall. That was a little bit better. And it certainly was a huge improvement. One of the things that happened about that time, they were trying to come up with a better way to have some kind of communications. And once the whistle got operating in the tower, that actually improved the whistle and made it so it was at least in an earshot. And when I got on, and Mike and Dick can verify this too, the whistle would blow, you would come down to the station, and you'd run in the door, you'd pick up the phone, and the operator would be on the other end of the phone. You'd go to the chalkboard, and they'd say, "Fire, Dick Edmonds' house, chimney fire, send trucks." This was talking to the operator. So when you come in, all of a sudden you got 5 or 6 guys trying to come through the door. "Let me in there!" And they'd be fighting to get in there, And so they'd start yelling, "Okay, get the doors open," Well, that was all well and good sometimes. And occasionally, guys would get a little carried away. They were just overhead doors that you pushed up by hand. And occasionally, one of the guys, or several of the guys I can think of, would come in, give the door a flip over, and you'd get the truck going, and you'd go to take off, and the door would come off the track. It was down into the hose bed. And so you'd be yelling, "Stop! Stop! You're gonna tear the door off!" So that was kind of a whole new era of that. But eventually, I'm going to back this up for a second. In 1893, they needed to really come up with some kind of water for the town and for the fire department. They decided the best way that they could do this was to appropriate some money. So they appropriated $25,000 to put in a water system. And they started to search around. They hired a surveyor that came in and started searching areas where they could possibly sit in, to have a pond. And Campbell Pond wound up being the spot where they decided to do that. And so in 1893, they borrowed $25,000 on a bond and proceeded to hire a contractor from Keene to put in a water main to town. Now that water main is something I brought in today. It's made out of wood, and it was made out of pine. And this was made so it was like a dowel and would slide the pieces together. They were made in 6-foot lengths. When this was a steel band that went around the wood, and they were covered in tar to seal them. So that was quite a thing. Now they hired a crew of guys to come in and start doing that. From Campbell Pond to Antrim is about 3.5 miles, and they dug that by hand, pick and shovel. There were no backhoes or anything. Through swamps, through whatever. And that was quite a feat in itself. One of the neat things about that whole thing was they went from trying to have water, which they eventually had, and a good stream of water. They also were able to, at the end, it was less than a year to lay that pipe. They, I'm trying to think if it was they borrowed money, something else too. Anyways, they eventually decided that, you know, they had 25, at the end they put 25 hydrants in town, which was a big plus. Then they had something to go to. But on top of doing that, they still had a way that they had to take care of horses and oxen that was still going through town. So they put water tubs around that they would fill up, so horses and oxen that were going through town or up on side roads or whatever had access to water too. And so that was a big deal. Should have had it quite a few years. By 1920s, they started having a lot of water problems with the pipe. It was leaking a lot. Places where the pipe laid in a lot of water, they started to rot. They decided they had to put in a new water line so that would help with fire protection. They proceeded to do that by hiring Coy and Pratt, which was a contractor of putting in a new water service. By that time it was steel pipe, and so they laid new pipe in the 20s and in the 30s, and they continued doing that for a long period of time until almost the Second World War, before they could actually finish installing the new steel pipe. In 1926, they decided that they still didn't have a truck or a first-line piece of equipment, except the fact they were still using wagons and pulling ladder trucks and stuff with horses. 1926, they bought a diamond reel, which was big time. It had a cost of $5,000. That was the start of it. That was a gun-ho. Into the 30s, they ran that truck, and one of the problems they started having with that truck was it got used so much, and they started overloading the truck with too much gear. And when it was doing that, it started breaking the wooden sprockets on the wheel because they overloaded the truck too much. Eventually, thank God, with Yankee ingenuity, they came up with a guy that actually changed over and had new rims put on so that they could load the truck a little heavy. The truck was in great shape. It was very active for a long time. 1940, they bought another new truck. Now they've gone big time. Now they get 2 frontline pieces of equipment. 1955, they finally bought another new truck. And this was all still at the old station down here. So that was really neat. And about that time, North Branch got their department going. And Marshall was just a wee lad then. And just trying to stick his 2 cents into everything. But he was very instrumental in trying to get the department up there up and running. The college was operating then, and so they really needed a couple of trucks up there. 1957, they bought a new pumper, and they also had an Army surplus tanker, which was a pretty good truck if you were able to drive it, which took 6 men and a boy to shift it and get it to go. But anyway, so those were 1974. They bought the truck that Mike was talking about earlier, which was a real truck, and that was a front-mounted pump, and they had, like Mike said, about 2,500 feet or 2,600 feet of hose. That was an awesome rig. It was just, if you go into a brook, set up the suction line, and if you had the patience, which I probably didn't at times, to try and prime it and get it going, it's like, oh Jesus, come on, get going. And finally, you know, there would be guys like Branch Beers would come along, and a very mellow, easygoing guy, and he'd have his pipe going, and I'll get that going for you, Joseph. You know, it wasn't a big deal, you know, and I'm like, oh, Branch, let's sort of before it off. And it was just those kind of stories that were very important to me. I'm going to kind of leave it at that. There is some other stuff, but I think I've outstayed my welcome here. But
On a
one of the
side note
things,
to your wooden pipe, I don't know if you guys, anybody went down Highland Ave, when they redid the water line this summer.
Yeah.
There was one section of wood pipe that was still on Highland Ave.
yeah,
And there were a couple of sections on Summer Street when they
Yeah.
did the work on Summer Street.
yeah.
So,
One of the other things I forgot to almost mention, when they started putting the steel lines and stuff in, to adopt off, this itself is called a corporation. They would drill the pipe, insert this corporation into the pipe. This was called a lead gooseneck. And this actually operated from the corporation into, back then it wasn't a lot of copper around. So a lot of the lines were galvanized and this was a neat thing. I can remember one of the first times when I was working for E.H. Edwards, he sent me back up to the creamery to get a corporation. And I was thinking all the way driving up there in the pickup truck, I'm thinking, what the hell is a corporation? And I'm thinking, is he talking about IBM stocks? You know, but it wasn't. This was the corporation. Unfortunately, I went in there and it was sitting on a table and I was like, aha, this is the corporation. So that's what that was. And this was a lead gooseneck. And they, finally, I think they've got the bulk of these pretty much are gone out of the water system and so forth. But these were just kind of neat things that we worked on a lot and always enjoyed. One of the last things I would like to say is, after I got off the department, I was still very close with Henry Cutter. I spent a lot of time with him and we were good friends. In 1998, he died. And I lost a very good friend. And Dick Atkinson came over to my house. One of the things we used to do with the 26 Rio was, the thing sat around pretty dormant for a long time. And Henry got me pretty much into, like, let's keep this thing going. So I had the bug, you know, it's like, oh yeah. So you had to handle that thing with kid gloves because it was very temperamental. It was, you know, you couldn't goose it too hard, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. It wasn't like jumping in a regular truck and going places with it. But he was a great guy, and he was a mentor to me in a lot of ways about stuff. And an extremely interesting guy, and he had a lot of old Yankee in him. He could be very stubborn, no two ways about it. And one funny story I'm going to tell you before I get to this last thing. One time in the springtime, Henry worked at the Ball Bearing. He never came to a fire unless he was called. If it was a bad fire, then we would call the Ball Bearing, and they would come from Peterborough to wherever, if it was a bad structure fire or whatever. In the springtime, one spring up on 31, up near where Hurlins lived, not Hurlins, Hearns lived. They had a big brush fire that had got started out back of the house. And so we went up there and we had trucks set up and whatever. Well, we still had the 1940 truck then. I got there and there was a bunch of guys, we got some backpacks on, guys, to try and get down into the woods to the old hand pumps, you know. And you could almost spit as much as that was coming out of those things, you know. But anyways, I got there, and at the time I was an officer, and I said, look, let's just drive the truck down a little closer to the pond and get the suction line in the goddamn water instead of screwing around with those goddamn backpacks, hand pumps. Okay? Now you got to remember, this is springtime in New England. So, drove the truck ahead, and when you know, it sunk right down over the running boards in the mud. About that time, Henry showed up. And he said, in his typical little wise-ass way sometimes, "Who in the hell did that stupid move?" I'm like, oh boy. So finally I said, Henry, it was me. I told him to drive the truck down there so we could drag a hole. He goes, "Joe, what the hell were you thinking about?" And I said, "Apparently I wasn't." No kidding. So that was there was a bazillion stories I could tell, but the last one I want to say, then I'll shut up, is when Henry died, and Dick Atkinson approached me about trying to get the old diamond reel going, and we did. And at Henry's service was at the Baptist church. We had the truck all shined up and clean, and when we carried his casket out, we slid it into the back of the old truck. I get choked up here.
They did the same thing for Charlie.
Yeah, and we slid his casket into the back of the truck, and we started down to the cemetery. And driving down there, the old truck was like bucking a little bit. I'm like, "Come on, old girl, don't pull this on me, you know." Like, you don't have to call a wrecker to come and pull us down to the cemetery. And we got down there, down to the cemetery, and we laid Henry to rest. But for me, I was driving the truck, and Dick Atkinson was beside me, and Dick Edmonds and Mike Beauchamp were standing behind on the back of the truck by the casket. And for me, that was an honor and a privilege to be able to do that. Henry absolutely loved that truck, and for me to give him his last ride on that truck down to the cemetery was a real honor. So that's all I got to say. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm just going to say a couple more things. So.
Go in the middle if you would.
All right. I can do that. So as far as some of the original history of the Antrim Fire Department, you can see I did bring in a ringer. I think Joe's probably about as knowledgeable as anybody. As far as the 26 Rio, we still have that truck, and it is up in the garage, up to the central station. So from time to time, we get some folks, and certainly Dick Atkinson played a big role to keep that running, and certainly someday we'd like to really restore that back to pristine condition. So there's certainly so many people I'd love to mention, men and women on the Antrim Fire that played such a crucial role. Rabideau family's here, and I certainly got to mention Charlie Rabideau. Certainly was a huge driving force up to the North Branch Station, captain up there for many, many years, back in the heyday of the Hawthorne College. Pretty much the roster of the North Branch Station were the employees of the Hawthorne College. So some good days there, and certainly want to thank everybody for coming. And one of my goals that I hope to accomplish before I retire as chief is I do want to get a roster of everybody that was on the Antrim Fire Department from its initial in 1850 to current. So I'm going to ask the historical department for some help on that, and I know that's certainly a huge undertaking, but certainly a lot of people that deserve recognition, and I always say that a person lives forever as long as we remember their name. So thank you, everybody.
Just a couple things. First, it's kind of impressive to be in a room when someone says chief, so many heads snap. I should have introduced myself. My name's Rick Wood. I'm part of the Antrim Historical Society Committee. If you're missing Steve Ullman in his lengthy introductions, he had to do some grandfather things today. I greatly appreciate all the information that you guys were provided today, and certainly it's a family affair. I think probably some people who go unnoticed are the families of the people who are part of it. They volunteered in their own unique way, right? We do have refreshments thanks to Barb Black and Kathy Wasloo, so feel free to get up. I would like any member or past or present to come up first so that we can maybe take a picture and maybe with some memorabilia, but the rest of you are more than welcome to go back. and we greatly appreciate you coming out on this cold January day, so appreciate it. Thank you.